Hello, and welcome back to Common Language, where we break down today's policy issues using common language to find common ground on common sense issues. Today is October 3rd. It is also the third day of the government shutdown, which we are going to dig into today. So things may change over the weekend. I will say it's not super likely to because Congress is not scheduled to take up any votes on Saturday or Sunday. Monday they might, and I think we're going to try to get this out on Tuesday. But for frame of reference, today is the third day of the government shutdown, October 3rd, and we're really excited to dig into how we got here, what's going on, and where we go next, and dive into some of the strategy and messaging that Republicans and Democrats have deployed around the government shutdown. So first, I'm going to kick it off to Casey to give us our top line in T and three, and then we will get into all things shutdown 2025.
Thanks, Mac. So for today's top line T and three, number one, Trump and Hegseth host a lecture to the military rolling out new standards. So they had a big summit at Quantico this week where they gave many lectures to the military, suggested advancing efforts to deploy military into cities for, quote, trading purposes and to combat the, quote, enemies from within. Kind of scary information that they think fellow Americans are enemies from within, but that was their messaging. The second piece of this was that they really want to reform the fitness and grooming standards for the military, calling them fatties, walking through at the Pentagon, and also trying to eliminate wokeness. This is concerning for a few reasons. Number one, to bring all of the military together in one area, they had to actually remove some of these generals from their active duties. They flew people across the world to be here, put them all in one room. Not the smartest from a national security standpoint. And they're insinuating that they need a lot more training and that they need to be groomed. And I personally feel that the military is going to take some offense to this. So we'll see how that ends up playing out. And if they do end up deploying military into cities, because as we've discussed on previous podcasts, he's talked about deploying in Chicago, he's talked about deploying in New York, he's talked about deploying in now Portland. It's all of these big major Democratic cities are where he's looking to target. So far, he's been able to get ICE in those cities, but not the military. And it's very unconstitutional to have the military involved in daily American life as it is. So we will see how they finagle that one. But number two, Supreme Courts give Cook a win for now. So the Fed is under fire from Trump because he really wants these interest rates to come down. One way that he targeted them was to try and remove Lisa Cook from her position on the board. This has been escalated, and so far the courts are siding with Cook, and she will remain in her position, but it will go to the Supreme Court in January and they will make the final call. So TBD, but so far she is winning that battle. And then our third piece, Bad Bunny will be headlining the latest Super Bowl. Sorry, I don't know what number it is.
60.
Bad Bunny will be headlining Super Bowl 60. For all those who know sports, this is a big deal. I only watched the halftime show, so for me, Kendrick Lamar was the highlight last year. What's really interesting about this is that Bad Bunny was recently on tour, and those tour dates were exclusively in Puerto Rico, and he did not come to the US for any of the shows. This was on purpose. He claimed that it was unnecessary for him, but we also know that Bad Bunny has taken a stand on ICE, and he's been very unhappy with the way that it's been handled stateside. So to have him now come and headline the Super Bowl, it's definitely a message. And Trump advisors have also suggested that ICE could be present at Super Bowl 60. More to come on that. And again, it goes back to what we're always saying, culture influence politics, influence culture, and there's always that intersection that shows where we're standing. So Mac, let's get into this government shutdown because this is a lot of technical jargon for the government to even shut down. So handing it off to you to really give us that tea on what the hell is going on?
Yes. As you guys know, there's a lot of technical pieces behind this, and we just want to peel back that layer. I'm excited to dig into this more because when I was on the Hill, I actually worked for a member who was on the Appropriations Committee, which is the committee responsible for drafting the initial appropriations legislation, deciding all of those numbers, and making sure that it moves out of committee onto the floor and then signed by the president. So I worked with different advocates and other members on the appropriations committee to decide what funding numbers would be for different programs. I'm very aware of kind of what goes into the process and how we got to where we are. In March, the federal government passed an appropriations bill that funded the government for the rest of the fiscal year, which is September 30th, because the government's fiscal year begins on October 1st. When that happened, a lot of people gave the Democrats hell, particularly Chuck Schumer, because he did not really advocate for any Democratic interests to be included into the appropriations bill. So, what is appropriations and what's an appropriations legislation? Appropriations is a law of Congress that provides an agency with a sum of money to be used for particular programs or projects. Appropriations legislation is considered must pass legislation. So it's super important. If appropriations legislation doesn't pass, there are significant consequences, i.e., a shutdown. So therefore, it must be passed at some point and enacted. Because of that time sensitive nature, because of the importance of appropriations bill, they are often amended with policy provisions or riders that are unrelated to the function of the bill itself. So the function of appropriations legislation is to fund the government. It's to say, Department of Education, you get $500 million to do this after school program. To say Health and Human Services, you get $700 million to research cancer. But what Congress will do is add on other provisions that don't have to do with funding, because this piece of legislation must pass. And it's very hard to pass legislation in Congress. So they tack on those things to the appropriations bill. So that's what people wanted Chuck Schumer to do in March. They wanted him to add things on to the appropriations bill and negotiate to add things on to the appropriations bill to get some wins out of it. And that's because appropriations bill, because of the filibuster, requires a 2/3 majority in the Senate. It has to pass on bipartisan terms, unless there's a 2/3 majority of either party in the Senate, which there is not right now. It requires both sides of the aisles coming together to pass the legislation. Examples of government funding are Pell Grants, SNAP, Head Start, different research projects that the government does, and also federal government workers themselves. Their salary comes from appropriated funds. And the government was unable to pass new legislation that would fund the government post September 30th, and thus triggered a shutdown. So, what happens when the government shutdowns? What does that entail? A government shutdown occurs when funding legislation required to finance the federal government is not enacted before the next fiscal year begins. In a shutdown, the federal government curtails agency activities and services, ceases non essential operations, furloughs non essential workers, and retains only essential employees in departments that protect human life or property. Shutdowns can also disrupt state, territorial, and local levels of government. And since in modern times, so going back to the 1970s, there have been overall 21 government shutdowns. The last shutdown was also the longest shutdown in government history, and that was under Trump 1. It started in 2018, at the end of 2018, and went into the top of 2019. It was like a 35-day shutdown, and people estimate that this wound up costing the economy an estimated $3 billion in lost GDP. Shutdowns often happen, as I was explaining before, because the minority party wants to use the threat or reality of a shutdown to leverage or advance their own policy goals. or sometimes there's just general disagreement over the funding levels themselves, right? Mm-hmm. What we're seeing now isn't necessarily about the funding levels themselves. That's not what they're fighting about. They're fighting about the fact that the minority party wants to leverage this opportunity to advance their policy goals. Another thing that's at the crux of this is it's not only the Democrats trying to leverage this process to advance their policy goals, but it's a resistance. It's an act of resistance against an administration that they believe has overreached their authority, particularly when it comes to government spending. And that's because a key part of the appropriations process in our country, as designed by the Constitution, is that Congress has the power of the purse. What exactly is the power of the purse? So constitutionally, Congress has the ability to tax and spend public money for the federal government. It's considered to be one of the legislature's most potent checks on the executive government and prevents the president and federal agencies from spending money without Congress's prior approval. So basically what that means, you get a paycheck. They take out money from your paycheck that goes to the government. Essentially, Congress has the most power in deciding where that money goes. And this Democratic Party feels that the executive branch, the president, has stepped on their toes. This administration has done a lot of clawbacks. They have done a lot of rescissions. They have done funding freezes. And the Democrats are like, we're not going to continue funding a government if the executive branch is just going to step on our toes and do whatever they want. So that's how we landed to where we are today.
Thank you so much, Mac, because it is a good example of democracy at play here, because it is forcing the Republicans' hand to a stoplight for them. Hey, we are not cool with this. This is a full stop here. And now we really have to start negotiating together. So it is a green flag just in terms of where our democracy is and it's working. Going back to March, Chuck Schumer came under so much pressure because they felt like the Democrats were laying over and letting the Republicans do whatever they want. Of course, they have control of the Senate, House, presidency. Where do we fight back? And this is that example now of, okay, they're fighting back even at the expense of a government shutdown.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And interestingly enough, I believe it was Kevin Hassett, who is one of Trump's top economic policy advisors. He's the director of the National Economic Council. He even said, to your point, essentially, this is democracy. This is one of the levers that the minority party in our country has to rebalance power. Yep. So in a way, we're seeing our democracy at work and functioning how it should. And that's why people got on Chuck Schumer back in March, because they're saying this is your opportunity. As the minority party, you don't get a lot of opportunities to advance your own interests, to rebalance power. But because the appropriation process requires that bipartisan support, given the way that it's structured, this is one of the levers they can pull. And to get into why Chuck Schumer didn't think that the timing in March was quite the right timing and why he thinks now is the right timing. But yeah, this is a function of our democracy, essentially.
Yep, totally. So, what is different from this time versus last time in terms of shutdown? Trump and Russ Vought, who is the head of Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, have threatened to use this shutdown to trigger reductions in force. And I do want to say that they've already done reductions in force. So this is not like a new play that they're using here. This is something that's already happening, and it's actually an argument for the Democrats. So during a shutdown, federal employees are furloughed, and the administration has tried to put pressure on Democrats by saying that they will continue to advance efforts to implement reductions in force, or RIFs, across federal agencies, and they will permanently fire them instead of furlough them. So this is a direct threat from Trump. He threatens us all the time. He's already done a lot of this. When we go back to DOGE, they were clearing house at a lot of federal agencies. So this is not a new threat, and it's already been done. But it's important to note too that while they do shut down federal employers and they furlough them and no one works, there are still some functions that still have to show up, such as TSA, such as the postal workers. Those people still work and they just work without pay. So if anyone remembers from the last shutdown, there were a lot of issues with airlines at the very end of the shutdown because at that point it had been over 30 days, a month, TSA employees had not been paid. And that's when you started to see the pressure happening because the airlines were no longer able to function, flights were canceled, and it just causes further damage within the ecosystem of the economy and the way things are running. So it'll be curious to see how that progression turns out this time. Something else that's different is Trump is aggressively trolling the Dems. Is this really that different? For Trump, no. But given the fact that the government is shutting down, it does bring up, is this the right time? Is this really what we should be doing? He should be focused more on how to reopen the government versus trolling. So before the government shut down, the Democrats had been vying for a meeting with Trump to negotiate with him. And he canceled one of the meetings because he said that Democrats were being unserious. He knew what they wanted to negotiate on, and he was not open to negotiating. But they did end up having a meeting finally with the four corners, House, Senate majority, and minority leadership. And during this meeting, Trump pulled out Trump 2028 hats. As a note, Trump is not eligible for re-election. We do not have third terms in this country. And House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries had reacted to this by asking VP J.D. Vance what he thought about that or if he had a problem with it, to which Vance replied, no comment. In addition, Trump posted an AI-generated video on Truth Social that depicted Schumer and Jeffries in sombreros with mariachi music in the background, saying things like, no one likes Democrats anymore. When J.D. Vance was pressed about this, he went on to say that Democrats can't take a joke, and this was just all in the spirit of fun, poking fun that the Democrats don't have support anymore, and people need to be a little more lighthearted. I think that Jimmy Kimmel would have a pretty different opinion on how the Republicans take jokes, specifically the president, but that's for another time. And then lastly, and something that is really unprecedented, is that on official government websites such as Hood and the USDA, there is actually propaganda on these websites that are saying that the government has been shut down due to the left, due to the Democratic Party, and citing that as a true source for the reasons of the shutdown. And that's dangerous for a few reasons. Number one, it's misinformation. And number two, it's a government website where we should have crystal clear communication. And important to note that a shutdown has occurred, but we don't play in the blame game at this point. So there's really a variety of things at play here. Lack of accountability from the side of the Republican Party. They want to push everything onto the Democrats. And also Trump pulling his normal tactics of threatening and bullying people. So on that side, it's nothing new, but it is super relevant now because they have to strike a deal to reopen the government, period.
So we all know here that the real underlying issue that the Democrats have is they believe the executive branch is overstepping their constitutional powers, especially the power of the executive branch to make decisions about congressionally approved funding without prior approval from Congress. However, the appropriations legislation isn't going to fix that, right? There's no legislation that's going to stop Trump from some of the things that he's been doing around government spending and overreach of executive authority in an appropriations legislation bill. So the Democrats need to point to a real policy issue or have a real policy axe at the table to advocate on behalf of and to leverage the appropriation process for. So what they've honed in on essentially is a lot of health policy issues. And there's two of them. The first one is expiring Obamacare subsidies. And what's happening here is that these subsidies are going to expire at the end of the year. These subsidies are for people who pay for their own health insurance. So they don't have health insurance through their employers and are not eligible or are not on Medicaid or Medicare. So they pay out of pocket for their own health care. What the government did back during COVID, when the Democrats controlled both the White House and Congress, is they enhanced these subsidies. And for the most low income people, made it essentially free for them to buy their own health care. However, it was a temporary funding boost. So these tax credits expire at the end of the year. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, estimates that if these tax credits were to expire at the end of the year, about 4 million people will become uninsured. And a host of other group of people, their insurance would just like increase. It would just be much more expensive. On average, people could see that their health insurance would increase about 114%. And so the Democrats are trying to use the appropriation process because we talked about this before. You can add things on to appropriations bills. So they are trying to say, you want our votes? Extend the subsidies in the appropriations legislation, and we'll pass a bill to keep the government up open, keep these funding levels at whatever level, and ensure that Americans will not lose their health insurance. What will that cost to extend those health insurance policies? CBO estimates that it would cost about 350 billion over 10 years, but it would boost the people with insurance by about 3.8 million. And what has happened is that the Republicans have said that Democrats are trying to give what they call illegal aliens or undocumented folks healthcare. We can get into the messaging of that. Is that baseless? Is that truthful? Whatever. But that's the argument that the Democrats are making. And then this is the rebuttal that we're hearing from Republicans. Another piece of this is that Democrats are also trying to repeal certain provisions around Medicare and Medicaid that were recently passed in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And you can go listen to what all of those provisions are in our OBBA episode. I think that's a reach. They're not going to undo OBBA. It just passed in July, but that's just one of the things that the Democrats are adding on as they message this and make it more about a health policy issue. And so that's what they're asking for. And that's where we're at this point. But overall, I think the shutdown has sparked a lot of conversations over who is responsible for the shutdown. As Casey, you were saying that on a lot of government websites, we see language like the radical left is responsible for this shutdown. But really, who owns this? When you have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican president in the White House, who is responsible for a government shutdown? And will this approach work?
That there is a circulating video from Donald Trump prior to him being a president saying that if a government was to shut down, it would be the president's fault. So one of the quirks about having a president who was previously more on the celebrity reality star track is that we have lots of footage. Roll the tapes. We have lots of footage of this man, and when they resurface, the timing is always impeccable because you always have an opinion when you're on the other side, and now here you are faced with these issues, and he's singing a very different tune. Not surprising due to his vast history of lying anyway, but it's funny.
That's what's so funny too about politics. Depending on what side of the coin you're on, you're saying one thing. Similar with JD Vance when he found himself in the Senate trying to force a shutdown when he was in the minority party. And he said, why would we not use this as leverage as the minority party to pursue our own interest? Now, fast forward to today, he's reprimanding the Democrats for shutting down the government in order to pursue their own policy interests. So it's a lot of flip-flopping here going on. And I think it's interesting to think about all of the other shutdowns we have seen and what the minority party was trying to fight for when the Republicans were in the minority. They tried to force a shutdown over repealing Obamacare. I don't think they've been super successful in doing that, but it's a way to advance your policy goals for sure. And now that the Democrats are in the position where they're using health policy as a way to have a win for their party, to be able to go back to their voters and say, look what we got for you guys, to
Right.
actually like advance this issue, for people to see it as a win and to push back against the Trump administration and the Republican majority. And the New York Times framed this super interestingly because Democrats have picked this healthcare policy issue, and healthcare is seen as an issue that most people trust Democrats with or side with Democrats on. And then we see Republicans trying to spin it and make it into an immigration issue, which is something that most Americans trust Republicans on. They feel like they have stronger policies and more effective policies when it comes to immigration. So they're playing to their strengths here. Who will ultimately win this battle?
There was a Times reporter who was interviewing Chuck Schumer this week about the shutdown and asking him some very specific questions. And he said, it's interesting that you guys are leaning towards a government shutdown over healthcare. When you look at the polling, healthcare is not one of the topics that the American people are looking for. The number one issue that they're upset about right now is actually the cost of living. And Chuck's rebuttal to that was actually healthcare is about to become extremely expensive and really impact that cost of living. So if we can leverage that now, we can help actually targeting that number one issue. So it is really all about how you frame it and how you see it. And that really impacts the vision of how you could form an opinion around it too. One of the facts that Chuck was saying was that their estimated increase was around $400 a month. And based on new reporting, it's going up to $1,500 a month. What was maybe like a $5,000 increase to your overall cost of living spend is now triple that. And that's really unaffordable. And that's really going to impact people's lives. Anyone who's really struggling to make ends meet now is going to have an even more challenging time once these bills are passed. And I do think that it is a pretty lofty goal to try and undo some of the one big beautiful bill. We know that's Trump's like piece de resistance, if you will. And that's going to be a tough one. So I think it does. But at the same time, like we were saying, this is the Democrats' only opportunity to fight. So I don't think that they have a choice in the matter. I think that they have to go big or go home. And it's what any negotiating tactic, go ask for the world and figure out what that middle ground could be. But if they don't start with a really high demand, they're going to end up with just peanuts at the end of the day.
Yeah. Politics is all a big game of like chicken and game theory and negotiation tactics. And I think that's why we've seen Trump be so successful in pursuing his policy goals, because he is a deal maker. He understands negotiations and he can do that very well. And I think it's been interesting to see the White House put JD Vance on the front line of messaging some of these things, because I've come to see what JD's value is in this administration. And that's the fact that we have Trump, who's the deal maker, and then you have JD, who's like the lawyer, right? He can talk the talk. He's very intelligent. He understands the law. He understands policy and how it all works. And he can speak to that. And then you have Trump doing all the wheeling and dealing. That's their little power team. We see the Democrats trying to combat that and the challenge that it presents, because they have got caught on to the healthcare policy issue. And to your point, Case, that's what makes it difficult, because I think it's hard to quantify healthcare and to put it into terms that translate into economic costs for your everyday citizen, because most of the time it doesn't become a burden until it's a burden. You don't need healthcare until you need healthcare and you're sick. We don't go to the doctors every single day. We don't need to use our health insurance policies every single day. A lot of times it's the emergency situations. And so it's hard to translate that into the economic and like day-to-day impacts that people feel. And I think that's going to be the challenge for Democrats. And I do think, though, also what this has revealed is that maybe people were a little bit too hard on Chuck Schumer in March.
Yeah.
Because as Chuck Schumer explained, back in March, The healthcare subsidies that they're fighting for weren't set to expire until the end of the year. So March is a little bit too early to say, oh, we need to fix this issue now. Let's hold up the government because these expire December 31. And also OPBA had not passed at that point. So you can't hold up the
Right.
government because you think the Republicans are going to pass a bill a month, 2 months from now. They didn't really have any legs to stand on. Yes, they were frustrated with the administration. Yes, the administration had fired workers illegally, had frozen funding illegally. But again, the appropriation process isn't the lever to fix that or to correct that. You need a leg to stand on, and this healthcare issue is their leg to stand on. And so I do think that it would have been a little too early to do it back in March, and that this is the right timing now that the subsidies they're about to expire, and now that we see what's actually in OBBA, right? I apologize to Chuck Schumer. I do see the vision, I see the strategy, but they have a lot of work to do
Yeah,
still.
yeah. When he was being interviewed by this Times reporter, he was very clear. I do not regret the decision in March.
Mm.
March was a different time. They had to almost let the Republicans like go a little bit.
Yeah.
Yes, was it extremely chaotic? Were they doing psychotic things? Doge was running amok and it felt very intense. And also, let's bring in also the layer of the media, right? The media is always amplifying everything and they're going to amplify whatever the big story is. But at the end of the day, it's still government. We still have process and procedure. And I think that Chuck was trying to honor that in a way the Democrats needed to be pushed to the absolute edge. And with the One Big Beautiful Bill passing, that was a low point for them and supplying billionaires with these tax cuts. And that is a moment for, okay, people are targeted and we really need to act now. So I do agree because otherwise it's what are you going to do? Shut down every time? It's not something that should be taken lightly and it's not something that should be used and abused. It needs to be used correctly and at the right time. And I think that just as you said, Mac, now is that time. And that's how Chuck was doubling down as well. He said, now is the time because the damage is done.
And I think that Trump has already played out the rifts, the reduction in force and the
Right.
layoffs and the firing. We don't need the government shutdown for an excuse for Trump to fire people. You're clearly
Right.
firing people when you want. So him threatening these whole like permanent reductions, I don't think is as effective anymore because we've seen him do that with or without a government shutdown. But it's also the underlying issue of the legislative branch versus the executive and the balance of power here. Because depending on how this plays out, we could see a shift continue to happen that gives the executive branch more unchecked power. And I don't have a crystal ball, and that's what's so hard with government shutdowns is people like, oh, how long is this going to last? How much damage will this do? There is no crystal ball. This is now up to our elected officials to really negotiate and duke it out. But ultimately, the outcome will also tip the scales in terms of how we think about the norms for the funding process in our country. Is it Congress as designated by the Constitution and how we've been doing things? Or do we think the president and the executive branch should have more power over funding and budget decision making? People are free to think whatever they want and have their own approaches to that. But I think it's been crazy that a lot of Republicans in Congress, knowing that appropriations is their big superpower, have let the president steamroll them, have deferred to him on so much of the funding stuff this year. It's been crazy.
Yeah, Trump. I know that he threatens to primary people all the time who aren't falling in line with his own party, but I've been thinking about this a lot too. The ways in which Mike Pence wasn't the VP that JD Vance is for Trump. I think that Mike Pence took the job without really knowing that he was also going to have to sacrifice his morals and values. And he, at the end of the day, wasn't really able to sacrifice those morals and values in the same way that Vance is blind loyalty allows him to do. Like, I don't think that Vance blinks an eye when he lies anymore. Even when he was talking about the AI generated, clearly racist video, he was saying, like, this isn't racist. Like, he's just really super comfortable going to bat for Trump over baby issues. Like, an AI video where Trump is clearly just making fun of people and bullying them is pretty low blow. You don't even,
Right.
if someone asks you about that, you can just deflect. You don't even need to give this whole answer, but he's willing to go really far to help Trump and be aligned with him. So I do feel like that's what's really different too. When you talk about the
Yeah.
executive branch, they're strong together.
Yeah.
Pence was not that guy for Trump. He wasn't.
Right. They're sticking together for sure. And it's his blind loyalty in pursuit of his own power, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he wants to be next up. And Pence, I don't think, was as ambitious in that way.
Yeah.
But I think, to your point, I believe Melania Trump's signature issues has been online bullying. And we see her husband, the president. I have a true question. Trump really
Right.
directly saying, I want you to put this, I want them wearing hats, I want them the music, I want to know who's actually doing that. Is it
Yeah.
Trump or someone else?
And I want
The
to know why
questions
he
that
thinks I want to know why he thinks that's funny. I feel like
yeah.
there's so many like legitimate funny things he could have done, and what he did was just not funny.
That's the troll humor.
Yeah.
And the troll humor, it is what it is. And there are times which I say, I go back to this all the time. I feel like I saw it on a TikTok once, and it's so true. I do have to give it to Trump that he is funny. And the TikTok joke was like, it's a shame that Trump is like so funny because he's also so evil. His humor and all of it. You think who does that? And then you just have to laugh too. But that aside, one thing I did want to point out too, there
Mm.
was a clip I saw of Representative Madeline Dean. She's a Democrat from Pennsylvania, and she was confronting Speaker Johnson about this video, coming to him saying, how do we have a president in office, the leader of your party, going online, putting out videos like this? It's ridiculous, don't you think? And Speaker Johnson said, there's unhinged people on the left too. And Representative Dean said, he's the president of the United States. Our allies are looking elsewhere and our enemies are laughing. And I
Mhm.
think that's so true because it is funny. Like, in one way, it is funny, right? And our
Yeah.
enemies, and to that point, our enemies are laughing
Yeah.
at us, though. They're not laughing with us. That's the
Mm-mm.
thing. That's the
Yeah.
difference. And our allies are probably like, what the hell? We can't work with these people. They're having government shutdown, posting these videos. So I feel like good for her for standing up and saying something and calling out this ridiculous video. And it is a shame that he is so unhinged.
Sometimes the only thing you can do is laugh because what's the alternative? But further, when we talk about the shutdown itself and what that means, I think back to what he had said in his own video, it does go down to the presidency because the president is setting a certain precedent that we won't work with you. Then, of course, you're going to feel like the pressures of how do we rise to the occasion? What are we going to do about this? Because we're being silenced. And we can't have a whole political party being completely silenced.
No, that's one of the questions at hand. One of the pieces of discussion is who is to blame for this? Is it the president? Is it the Republicans who control Congress and the White House? Is it the Democrats who are refusing to vote on this? There's no answer as to whose fault this is. So let's start there. I think what that raises and what it speaks to is the fact that in a democracy, even if you have the majority, you still have to work and compromise with the minority party. And Trump and the Republicans have not shown themselves to Democrats to be good faith participants in the negotiations process, in the compromising process, in the way that they've been governing. They've just been like rolling over the Constitution and the laws and precedents, right?
Mhm.
And so now the Democrats are like, why would we work with you? You guys have not shown yourself to be good partners, good
Mhm.
collaborators, good counterparts in this democracy. Even when you're in power, you still need the minority party sometimes. Another thing that the administration likes to talk about is like the mandate, right? They have a mandate because President Trump won the election and the Republicans control Congress. Okay. And you still need Democrats to keep the government open. And
Right.
so you can't just do whatever you want and then expect the Democrats to back you and keep funding a government that you have so lawlessly and like recklessly gone about.
That's what it is too. It's like this lawlessness that they're all comfortable with. We have Republicans who are so afraid to stand up to do the right thing, even when they know that they're actively doing the wrong thing for their constituents. They've gotten so comfortable doing that. So
Right.
it's that normalizing process that we're seeing from the Republican side. And I actually feel like that's going to be the biggest challenge here because Trump has no interest in negotiating with Democrats. He's super comfortable blaming this entire thing on them and just waiting for them to cave. And I don't think they're going to cave.
I don't think so either. I feel like they've had it. I feel like
Yeah.
it's like the buck stops here
Hmm.
moment for the Democrats. And AOC talked about this too. She was like, to your point, they get away with doing this because they're perceived to be all powerful. We perceive that there's nothing we can do to stop this, so we just have to comply. But we need to wake up and see, no, there are ways to put a stop to this. This is not the time to fold. So I don't think the Democrats are going to fold on this. And I do think in part like they picked a good issue too, because a lot of the implications of these expiring tax credits will impact people across red states just as if probably more, I think, than in some of the blue states. And there is a contingency within the Republican Party that are on board with giving the Democrats what they want as far as extending these subsidies. So the Republicans are going to try to make cracks in the Democrat Party by going after some of those moderates. We did see on the last vote that the Senate took that the senator from Maine, who's an independent but caucuses with the Democrats, he voted in favor of the bill that would have kept the government open. And Mastro Cortez, we saw her also give a vote to the legislation that would have kept the government open. So I think the Republicans are going to try to chip away at some of those more moderate Democrats and get them to flip. I think in addition, since they had those two vote for the past one, I think they would need like five more or something. So we'll see if they will who will be more successful. The Republicans chipping away at these moderate Democrats to get them to flip, or Democrats getting to Republicans to get on board with these extensions and see if they'll flip. But you throw in a president who has so much influence over these
Mhm.
members. I don't know which way they'll go. I don't know how long this government shutdown will last, but I do think that the Democrats are ready to stand like 10 toes down on this. So for that, I could see it going on for a pretty long time.
Yeah. So can I. And I feel like this is going to be a pretty historic moment in terms of Trump's presidency and his legacy because the last shutdown was on his watch. The current shutdown is on his watch. One other thing that AOC did mention while the government and Trump want you to perceive them as doing a great job and everything's going according to plan, she was advocating that they're not doing well. Things aren't good. They're not what they seem, and they're not winning this battle. We're still in it. We're here, and we can save democracy and temper his whole mission. So, part of that is using this government shutdown as leverage and then taking it from there. So, curious to see what that really means and how we're going to end up working together to fix this whole thing. But we'll have to keep everyone posted because right now it is day 3, no end in sight, and a lot of confusion and chaos.
Yes, we will definitely keep you all posted, especially on our socials like TikTok and Instagram with any developments that come about. The House is scheduled to come back into session next week, so there may be some movement there. Negotiations are clearly ongoing, but follow us on our socials for any of the latest and greatest.
Mhm.
And we will be back next week with more.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.